Welcome back everyone. Today I'm going to show you how to make a toddler beanie. And this is a unisex pattern. It's not a one size fits all. This pattern includes multiple sizes. And also I'm going to show you how to work with different fabrics to get the right fitting hat. And we'll go more into detail on this once we get started. This is a super easy sewing project, so if you are new to sewing, you should have no problem following the easy step-by-step tutorial. With all that being said, if you are new to the channel, grab that printable pattern and let's get started. Getting started with supplies, you'll need 1/4 to 1/2 yard for your main fabric. I recommend using a very stretchy rib knit fabric if you can find it. This type of fabric is very hard to find in the right stretch. That's why I split this pattern up into different sizes, so you can use the correct size with the correct stretch fabric. On the pattern, there is a ruler where you can test the stretch of your fabric. And what I did is cut out a 2-inch width square, held it down to the ruler at 0, and see how far I could stretch it. And I tested this on most of my stretchy fabrics. I came to the conclusion that anything under 3 inches is not that stretchy, and anything over 5 inches is very stretchy. If your fabric falls in that section, I recommend using the medium stretch pattern. Anything under, use the light stretch pattern, and anything over 5, use the high stretch pattern. And again, this isn't perfect science because all fabrics do act differently and they stretch differently, so you may have to play around with it to get that perfect fit out of your fabric. But using the spectrum of sizes I provide in the pattern, you will be able to dial it in from there. And another quick thing to keep in mind is the thickness of the fabric. This also plays in the role in what size to use. If your fabric is very thick, then a smaller size, it's gonna end up being super small and it's not gonna probably stretch and fit over your head. So this is one more small thing to keep in mind as you're sewing. And that's why I always recommend grabbing a little bit more of the fabric you're using so you can play around with it and find that sweet spot. And before we get started, don't forget to download the PDF pattern. This pattern is super easy to use. It's available at properfitclothing.com. All you have to do is download it, print it off, tape it together, and you're ready to go. Before you tape it together, the best thing to do is to cut off the top and one of the side edges. This is gonna allow you to overlap the pages for a perfectly aligned pattern. And once you have all your supplies gathered and your pattern printed out, it's time to move into cutting. And after taping your pattern together, it should look like this. For the best results, I highly recommend checking your printer alignment. And if you know what type of fabric you're working with and the size you need, you don't have to print out all of the pages. You just have to print out the pages that correspond with the stretch of your fabric. And from here, we're going to cut the pattern on the outside of the black line. After cutting out your fabric, you should end up with one main panel cut on the fold. So when you open this panel up, it should be perfectly symmetrical on both sides of that center fold. And before we get started with sewing, I want to quickly show you how you can adjust this pattern to make it a little bit taller or a little bit shorter. Locate the adjust at center box on the pattern and cut directly down the center guide. From here, all you have to do is bring the panels together to make it shorter, or move them apart and add a little bit of paper in the center to make it taller. This is the quickest way to adjust the height while keeping it perfectly symmetrical. Moving on to construction, grab the main panel, and the first thing we're going to do is lay the fabric out and place the right sides together. Quickly stop and double check to make sure the stretch is going in the correct direction. If that checks out, locate the side mark guides on the pattern. These are going to be the dashed lines furthest towards the outside edge. And essentially what we want to do is make those marks on the outside edges of our fabric. If you adjusted the height like we talked about, just line up the points of the pattern with the points of your fabric. And the biggest thing for this step is to check to see if the marks are directly across from one another. We're going to be sewing the top side seam, but before we can do that, we want to double check to make sure all the points are perfectly lined up. So add a 1/4 inch seam allowance from one side mark to the opposite side mark. And real quickly before we get into sewing, we're going to be using a serger for this project. These are super great for knit fabrics. They allow you to sew stretchy fabrics without breaking the thread. And another great thing, they also cut and clean up that edge as you're sewing. All in all, giving you a more professional look. But if you don't have a serger, that's totally fine. You can still use your regular domestic sewing machine. All you have to do is switch your machine to a zigzag stitch, adjust the height and width to your preference, and this is going to allow that thread to stretch with the fabric. Both of these methods work great. It's just something to keep in mind if you plan on selling these. Sometimes working with these knit fabrics, I find it's hard to get that perfect cut. So that's why I like working with the serger, because it's going to cut and clean up that edge and essentially leave me with a nicer looking product. After finishing up the stitch, quickly check and see if both of the layers got stitched together. Sometimes part of the edge slips out, so it's nice to check this before you get too far. For the next step, we're going to be sewing the peaks, so we're going to spin it around so we're looking at one end. Separate both sides, and essentially what we're going to be doing is sewing that triangle to the outside edges for the back part. For the front part, spin it around and do the same thing on the opposite end. Before I get too ahead, we're going to spin it back around and just do one edge at a time. Place the right sides together, lining up the top point in the center. Place a pin because we'll be stitching that edge. Flip it around to the opposite side, place the right sides together, place a pin, spin it to the other side, and do the exact same thing. Line up one edge for both sides. So to clear it up, you'll be adding 4 seams, 1 on each side of the fabric for both ends. Once you make this once, you'll see what I mean, and you'll be able to do all of these at once to save time. After finishing up the 4th peak seam, we're going to double check, make sure all the layers got stitched together. With these seams added, you can already start to see the peak form, and it's curving slightly inward. To finish that off, all we have to do is the same thing on the opposite side of that center triangle. So starting with one side at a time, we're going to spin it, separate the layers, and we're going to do the exact same thing as we did in the previous step for the opposite side of the triangle. Place the right sides together, lining up the top peak, and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Don't forget to spin it around and do it on the opposite end. All in all, giving you a total of 4 new seams. And like I said before, after you've made this hat a few times, you can do all these seams at once, saving you a ton of time. With all 8 seams complete, I like to double check to make sure the seams are pointing directly towards the center of that panel, or as close as possible, because the more symmetrical this hat is, the better it's going to fit on your head. Anyways, moving on from here, we're going to roll the hat in half with the wrong sides together so the right side is facing out. And what we're trying to do is fold it exactly in half so everything lines up at the top. And I found the easiest way to finish off that top edge was to line up all the seams directly in the center. Line up both of the side seams, the folded edge and the seamed edge. If done correctly, they should be fairly parallel to each other. With everything lined up, we're going to stitch that top edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Depending on what type of fabric you used, it can be very bulky, so take your time and use the correct needles. With the serge complete, it's best to double check to make sure all those layers got stitched together, because when you're working with 4 layers like this, it's easy for one part to slip out and then you have an opening when you flip it right sides back out. But if everything is looking good and all the layers are stitched together, we're going to flip the right sides out. And the sewing portion of this project is complete. Unless you're adding on some sort of tag branding, then you'll still have to sew that on. But we're going to roll that bottom edge up. You should be able to roll that bottom edge up a couple inches and still have it cover your toddler's ears. Moving on to the final step, and that's adding your branding if you choose to add that. When it comes to adding branding on stretchy fabric like this, if you are sewing it on, you really have to stretch it out before you sew it on, or that hat's not going to stretch right and it's going to fit really weird. That's why I added mine with 1 rivet so you can stretch it and it's not going to affect the fit. Since it's super quick to make this hat, it's really fun to play around with different fabrics, different sizes, and find stuff that's unique and different. And overall a better fit for your kid, because you can dial this pattern into the exact fit for the fabric you're using. And as your child gets older, you can keep making new ones as they grow. But really the biggest thing to keep in mind, if it doesn't turn out or if it's too small, you really have to look at the pattern and find the right pattern for the right stretch fabric. That's why I added so many to this pattern, to make it easier for you to work with the fabric you have. And the best way to really do that is to just test out a size with the fabric if you're unsure of the stretch, see how it fits, and then go from there.
And there you have it, your toddler beanie is complete. Thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel. Hopefully you were able to dial in the pattern to work with your fabric and get that nice fitting hat. And like I said before, it does take a little bit of time and patience playing around with a different style fabric if you're using one outside the rib knit family. And trust me, I worked with a ton of fabrics on this pattern to really dial it in and make it easier for you. And like always, tag me on Instagram at Properfit Clothing. I love to see how your work turns out. But other than that, I'm gonna keep the videos coming at you, so I'll see you next time.